Då är ni varmt välkomna att följa det samtalet som jag ska ha med Isobel Frye här från SPII, vår partner i Sydafrika. Good to see you, Isobel. How are you?
Thanks, Eric. I'm well. Spring has just officially broken here on the 1st of September. However, the weather seems to have gone back to winter. So apart from that, it's an interesting time. We're still in soft lockdown here in South Africa, so the sense of isolation is great. My daughter went back to school yesterday for the first time.
For the first time since March.
Exactly, yeah. So she's a little nervous, but the social distancing is continuing, and she's very relieved to be back with her peers. So, yeah, a mixed bag.
Of course. But you're still working from home, and that will be the situation for you for the whole autumn, or rather for your spring.
That's correct. We are fortunate enough to be able to work with social distancing. Retailers and that are back, but we don't see a change in the immediate future. Although the levels of lockdown have been lifted, the message is still that social distancing is preferable.
Sometimes when it's talking about the immediate effects of the pandemic, but then the indirect effects, the economic and social effects are of course very, very difficult for countries like South Africa. Can you share some statistics about that situation, that in terms of people living in poverty and inequalities that are on the rise in South African society as a result of the pandemic?
Definitely. And Eric, I think you know from our partnership between Church of Sweden and Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute that we have been analysing for the last decade at least the high levels of pre-existing poverty inequality. So just to share with you, prior to the main impact of COVID, we were looking at poverty levels of about 60% of people living below the poverty line, 1 in 4 living in hunger, perpetual hunger and starvation. Unemployment for the first quarter of 2020 had increased to 40%. It's a broad definition of people.
40% of all South Africans.
Of all South Africans. Again, age cohorts were affected differently. So for people between the ages of 15 and 24 within the labour market, so not in school, employment, or training or education, we were looking at 60%, between 60 and 70% of people had not a formal job. We've seen an increase in long-term unemployment in excess of a year, and that's a general global marker of not going back into employment. So unemployment and poverty were incredibly high before COVID. Inequality, South Africa is known in terms of income and wealth inequality as being the highest in the world. So the pre-existing fault lines were dire. We've had some of the statistics coming in since COVID. For instance, in the month of April, 3 million jobs were lost. What we have also seen is just that informal livelihoods have been shattered, both through lockdown, but also through the increase in retrenchment of companies closing. People just don't have access to the cash to sustain the sort of lower level kinds of economic activities, the more informal activities, and that has been devastating.
What has been the response from the government on the one hand and from civil society and faith communities on the other to this devastating situation in South African society and for people living in poverty and are very vulnerable?
I think let's start with the state response. The initial reaction to COVID and the hard lockdown from March, which came through to April, was very immediate, very absolute. And what civil society indicated to the state from that time was, with the impact on livelihoods, as you mentioned, there needed to be some kind of response, some kind of support to people. The initial response in April by the president was a very encouraging one. It referred to social cash transfers, social grants being increased to people. Currently, pre-COVID, 18 million people were receiving cash income transfers. Those were going to be topped up. There was also mention of social relief of distress grant, which is going to go to all unemployed working age people. In our social security system, there is historically no support for working age people between the ages of 18 and 59, as the idea of full employment from the 70s and 80s, and before that still continued to be the accepted policy idea, even though the reality fell short. So it was a really important moment where the state said that they would be providing income to 80 to 59-year-olds, and yet unfortunately, that has really not come about. It was meant to be part of a stimulus to invoke a recovery, and yet our National Treasury has not made that money available. So, in fact, in a meeting recently, I put it to the President that he was making wide, sweeping, generous promises to people, which were in line with our Constitution, and yet he was being undermined by the Minister of Finance, who wasn't making that budget available. So there was quite a harsh response from National Treasury to that question of mine, but that really is the indication. And so civil society has been very strong in coming together. I think one of the things that we've done is to work very closely in collaboration, which in recent years had fallen away. So that's been really positive.
And in this context, you're also promoting a basic income grant for South Africans as part of the recovery efforts and to stay permanent in South Africa.
That's true. As early back as 2002, it was a policy recommendation that came out of a ministerial committee of inquiry. There is an ideological rejection which is unintelligible, really, given the economic situation. So one of the things that has come back onto the agenda, and various other countries have looked at this as well, has been a universal basic income. There are so many people who fall into vulnerability that our argument is the problems of exclusion right now, by having means-tested grants, by having high obstacles of eligibility are such that would be far more just and equitable, as well as make economic sense if the net was cast wide and people were included. And for those who have income, that could be taken back through a tax system. So we're strongly arguing for it. I've been in meetings within the ruling party, the African National Congress, where it's being debated at the highest level. The concerns that we have is that civil society needs to be making sure that progressive new ways of thinking, not the orthodox neoliberal ways of thinking, are increasingly held. And I just wanted to come back to one of your questions, which is that about the faith-based organizations and the church. The South African Council of Churches, which is a body that many people will know from anti-apartheid times, has really come strongly to the fore. The ability of the SACC to bring forward people's realities has been significant.
SACC is South African Council of Churches.
Yes, sorry, that's correct, the South African Council of Churches. I think it's building a lot also on its work around anti-corruption, which brought it to the limelight again last year for the first time in many years. And so what the faith-based organizations are doing are to organize really localized networks of people who are able to provide support. It has been critical, and they've also been working in difficult situations because of lockdown. I think many of the traditional churches were keen to have face-to-face meetings, but have taken on the line that they won't do so, because to do so would put people into dangerous situations. I know from a different source of information that a number of the pastors and priests have contracted COVID through the funerals, and yet they are, like the frontline healthcare workers, I think really showing a kind of empathy and leadership that has brought the sector, which has been quite dormant for a while, back into leadership.
Well, that's good to know that everyone is involved and are very much engaged, also from the faith communities. Time is running out, Isobel, but in your view, how will the pandemic and the response to it from faith communities, from government, change the South African society in the future years? What will be the lasting effects, do you think, of this crisis?
With regard to the possibility for reform going forward, I'm still positive. I think there is an opportunity to engage. It might be that the indicators have to be worse before society pulls together. But to an extent, I think that the civil society and the moral leadership of people, including the faith-based organizations, need to step above the chaos and uncertainty, the anxiety, because we certainly can't get out of this individually, but it has to be a united effort. And for us, again, we're recognizing that South Africa is not an island, that our neighboring states need to be brought on board. But also, South Africa is part of a global network of countries to understand and learn both the positives and the concerns with regards to second wave. So, I mean, the question, like for all countries, I think has a big question mark over it. But there are certainly ways that we can be shaping a better future and it's the activism, it's the collegiate solidarity that we need to be emphasizing.
Thank you so much, Isobel, for being with us here online from South Africa, and thanks for your contributions. We'll be in touch again.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Definitely. Take care.
Take care.